Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again for another tale from Convicts and Cops. Today we will be discussing Nuestra Familia First Captain, Death Row Joe Gonzales, and his rise and fall from power. We will also cover a series of devastating court cases that marked the end of DR's role as an organized crime boss. But before we begin, here's a quick word from our sponsor from Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12. There is a way which seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. This sort of encapsulates the well-known saying, you can't take it with you. This is especially true with the ways of that life. We will begin in 1965 with death row's commitment offense. On Friday, July 30th, 1965, during the evening hours preceding 10 p.m., Death Row Joe and friends were riding around or cruising in Daniel Alarcon's automobile. Joe Gonzales, age 24, was the eldest of this group. Daniel Alarcon was 19 years of age, his brother David was 15 years old, and Bobby Joe Barkley was 14. David Alarcon was driving the automobile because Daniel had been drinking earlier in the day and was feeling high and quite jovial. Gonzales had also been drinking, but he had not consumed as much as Daniel and manifested no effects. The group cruised for some time in and around La Colonia, which is a Mexican section of Oxnard near the railroad depot. At approximately 10 p.m., their car ran out of gasoline at a point near the railroad yard and a short distance from the Alarcon residence, which was located at the other side of the yard. Daniel Alarcon suggested they walk to his house to get money to buy gas. The group thereupon set out on foot across the railroad yard on their way to the Alarcon home. While walking across the railroad yard, they sighted three older men who were also crossing the yard, but from a different direction. Jesus Ontiveros, age 35, Juan Baca Lujano, age 54, and Felix Perez Servin, age 35. These men had been drinking beer at several bars near the yard and were headed toward another bar in the vicinity. Ontiveros, who had been drinking beer since late afternoon, was quite intoxicated. The two groups came together and a fight erupted. Servin fled, but the conflict continued, with Gonzales, Ontiveros, and Lujano all having knives. All parties involved, except for Barkley, received knife wounds. Gonzales inflicted very severe wounds upon Ontiveros and Lujano. In a short space of time, the conflict ended. Lujano's wallet was taken from him, and the group of youths fled, leaving Ontiveros and Lujano lying in the yard severely wounded. The police arrived about 10:30 p.m., found Ontiveros and Lujano lying on the ground, and took them both to the hospital. Both men had several knife wounds and were bleeding profusely. Upon admission to the hospital, Ontiveros was found to be in a state of irreversible shock due to loss of blood. He died the next morning. Lujano, although in critical condition, subsequently recovered from his wounds. Death Row Joe was arrested 2 days after the murder. On November 11, 1965, Death Row Joe was found guilty of first-degree murder. A jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for 17 hours over a 2-day period after a trial that lasted 27 days. DR testified that he was defending himself and his friends from an aggressive Ontiveros who attacked them with a knife. A key piece of evidence was whether Ontiveros was left-handed or right-handed. Death Row demonstrated in court how Ontiveros attacked him and held a knife in his right hand. The district attorney put on evidence that Ontiveros was in fact left-handed. The penalty phase was up next to decide if Death Row Joe would be condemned to the gas chamber or be sentenced to life in prison. During a portion of the penalty trial, Dr. Donald S. Patterson, a Santa Barbara psychiatrist, examined Death Row Joe. He testified that DR was a sociopathic personality with no strong hope of improvement. Several Oxnard police officers testified that Death Row Joe had been arrested 12 times for several crimes, including robbery from a supermarket and a liquor store warehouse, possession of marijuana and other narcotics, and possession of a switchblade. In mitigation, his wife testified they were married 6 years prior in Tijuana when she was only 16 and he was 18. She also said that Death Row was a good father to their 3 young sons, the oldest of which was only 4 at the time. It was also revealed during the penalty trial that DR lost his parents at an early age, losing his mother at 4 years old and his father after that. He then bounced around relatives and foster homes, even spending 2 years in a sanitarium for treatment of tuberculosis when he was a young boy. DR's uncle testified that he struggled to catch up in school after the lengthy illness, also revealing DR didn't like school, nor would he stay in school. On November 28, 1965, the jury voted the death penalty as a suitable punishment for Death Row Joe Gonzales. He became one of 60 men on San Quentin's condemned row awaiting execution. It did appear his life would be coming to a premature conclusion, but he wasn't going to go easy. DR began filing appeals. On April 26, 1967, the California Supreme Court ordered a new trial for Death Row in a 6-1 decision because the trial court erred in admitting statements by a co-defendant as evidence that were prejudicial to DR. On September 12, 1967, the second murder trial got underway, and just as before, Death Row Joe was convicted, but instead of the death penalty, he was sentenced to a term of 7 years to life with the possibility of parole. He was moved from San Quentin's death row onto the main line, out of the frying pan and into the fire, so to speak. Let's briefly discuss the prison dynamics in play at the time of DR's release from death row onto the main yard. The Mexican Mafia, a decade prior in 1957, had already come into existence thanks to a 17-year-old California Youth Authority ward housed inside DVI, the Dual Vocational Institution. Luis Flores, a.k.a. Güero Buff from Hawaiian Gardens, began to bring together the cream of the crop of the Mexican gang underworld behind the walls. Instead of fighting amongst themselves as the street gang rivalries dictated, they became known as carnales, Spanish for brothers. The newly formed gang then leveraged their power base to take what they wanted and enjoy the small creature comforts available in prison, both legal and illegal, so they could do easy time. As the Mexican Mafia matured, they began to take over the rackets in prison, formalize their code of conduct, complete with reglas and a death oath. And in the 70s, they would move out to the streets and become a modern-day organized crime syndicate. The Mexican Mafia's rise to power didn't go unnoticed. In 1965, a second group of Chicanos, also from Southern California cities, came together at Soledad Prison to form the second prison gang in the California Department of Corrections. The common narrative is that the Nuestra Familia Mexicana, as the gang was originally named, was formed as protection against the Mafia's predatory practices. But according to DR's debriefing notes, the founders wanted to replicate the Mariposa success of generating money on the yard. These men wanted their issue también. I also have said that despite having some initial quality control issues, Their original core of members was almost a copy and paste of La M. In his debrief, Death Row Joe named the founders as Little John Valdez from Little Valley, Freddy Gonzales from San Diego, Gonzalo Chalo Hernandez from Bakersfield, and Bruce Güero Morgan from Clanton. The first constitution, or organizational structure, is referred as the Padre system. This was a vertically integrated organizational structure utilizing family member titles for positions of rank versus the second constitution that came later that also was a vertically integrated organizational structure arranged along military lines. Little John was the first boss, or padre, of the new prison gang. It was only a matter of time before the Nuestra Familia and Mexican Mafia came into conflict. This took place in the Shoe War of 1968 at San Quentin. Following the 1968 Shoe War, the Nuestra Familia took control of San Quentin. Mexican Mafia members and their close associates, today they would be known as Sureños, were not allowed to walk the line at the Big Q. From the book Alpha Guard, the autobiography of William Bill Hankins, we now know that Sergeant Hankins employed the inmate services of NF First Wave members Chalo Hernandez from Bakersfield, Freddy Gonzales from San Diego, and Black Jesse Valenzuela from Chiques, who collaborated with him, Sergeant Hankins, to identify and monitor Mexican Mafia guys on an ongoing basis to keep them locked up and off the yard. I can tell you from my interviews and examination of debriefing reports and older classified documents, there is nothing that reflects that Death Row Joe and the main body of NF guys such as Babo Sosa, Black Bob Vasquez, Daira Medina, and many more were aware of these activities. I further believe back in that specific time frame, had DR and the other NF members become aware of his fellow familianos collaborating with the man, DR would have been the first to raise his hand to take their wind. Beginning in about October of 1970, the Nuestra Familia had enjoyed a peaceful coexistence with the Mexican Mafia due to a truce that was first brokered by Louis Araujo from Eloyo Maravilla between Nuestra Familia Padre, Chalo Hernandez, and MS shotcaller Big Mike Mulhern from Primera Flats, when Big Mike became the first mafioso allowed on the San Quentin main line since the infamous Shoe War. Chalo confirmed this truce with Cheyenne Cadena when Cheyenne was housed in San Quentin's B section between January 21st and February 1st, 1971, in a brief layover on his way to Chino for his impending parole. However, not everything was well. Death Row Joe later stated during his debrief, and I quote, "Every day that passed, the familia was losing the respect of the yard, as all they were doing was living on a past reputation. The power of the familia was being tested all the time, and instead of going forward, the familia was losing ground. The strength of the familia was getting weaker and weaker as members were going home, and others were being locked up. All this was taking its toll, and an incident took place where a familia member had some wine thrown in his face by an MS sympathizer. This was common knowledge on the yard. Everyone was waiting to see what the familia would do, as this man must be hit as an example to others. But he wasn't hit, adding insult to injury." End of quote. Then, in December of 1971, a dispute arose between the Nuestra Familia and Mexican Mafia over the property rights to a homosexual inmate. These types of inmates were referred to as punks or queens. Some could even reach the status of a wife or old lady if involved in an exclusive relationship. The owner of the queen owed money to both the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia. When he failed to pay his debt, Mexican Mafia member Manuel Buff Perez from Clover knocked out the owner and took the punk with the intention of prostituting him to generate revenue for the clica. The Nuestra Familia felt that they had a stake in the punk as well, due to the former owner owing them money also. A compromise was reached and the Nuestra Familia agreed to the M's ownership of the punk, except for one newly made familiano, Daniel Woodsy Reyes from Bakersfield. He did not want to yield to the mafia and kept disputing the issue. On April 4th, 1972, things came to a head when M. Carnales Philip Black Segura from Eastside Clover, Raymond Chavo Perez from Bakersfield, and Manuel Chita Padilla from Chino attacked NF Familianos Woodsy Reyes and Death Row Joe. They were stabbed non-fatally on the ramp leading from the chow halls to the lower yard. The Familia would retaliate on April 10, 1972, when Frank Joker Mendoza stabbed mafioso Louis $1 Million Lou Valenzuela, also non-fatally. The resumption of hostilities, I call these the first shots, have been fired. On July 21, 1972, a fight broke out in San Quentin's B section between the Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Mexican Mafia as they returned from the evening meal. Aryan Brotherhood member Tommy Shoup suffered a superficial stab wound from a shank made from what appeared to be a bed spring. Mafioso Philip Black Segura suffered bumps and bruises. Death Row Joe suffered a cut over the eye and a fat lip, as you can see from the picture, and Daniel Woodsy Reyes suffered bumps and bruises in the melee. In one of the CDC 115 disciplinary reports, Joker Mendoza complains that prison staff knew there would be trouble when they moved mafiosos Black Segura and $1 Million Lou up to the 5th tier. Of course, it was Joker who had stabbed $1 Million Lou in the back a few months earlier. After the murder of Cheyenne Cadena in Palm Hall on December 17, 1972, Frank Joker Mendoza from Redondo, Juan Manzanas Colon from New York, and NF associate Raymond Tiny Contreras from San Jose were indicted and tried for Shy's murder. They subpoenaed influential NF members to Palm Hall to discuss the new constitution. According to Abundio Padilla, those members were Daira Medina, Death Row Joe, Manuel Bozo Torres, and Babo Sosa. Padilla testified that he met Joe, Death Row Joe Gonzales from Oxnard in San Quentin in 1972. He stated that Death Row Joe and another member named Robert Daira Medina from San Fernando were drafting a new constitution complete with bylaws to reorganize the NF. Death Row Joe offered Babo the position of Nuestro General. Babo then appointed Death Row Joe as first captain. Daira Medina became second captain. On April 17, 1973, West Valley Municipal Court Judge David Miriam bound over Mexican Mafia member Robert Chito Elias, Camarada Little Joey Ortiz, and Camarada Frank Joseph Ruiz to West Valley Superior Court to stand trial on April 27, 1973, on one count of assault with a deadly weapon for the stabbing of the Aranda brothers in the Sallyport area leading to the exercise yard of the Reception and Guidance Center in Chino. The Aranda brothers were also members of the Nuestra Familia. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, the trial would be delayed. While Death Row Joe was at Chino discussing the new constitution, he was caught with a prison-made stabbing instrument and was facing a single count of possessing a weapon while in prison. As a result, he too transferred to the San Bernardino County Jail to respond to the charges. On June the 8th, 1973, M.S. Chito Elias, NF's Death Row Joe, and Isaac Trenell, a BGF member, were placed in a holding cell with 27 other unaffiliated convicts at 4:30 a.m. to be transported to the courthouse. Deputies heard a commotion in the holding cell and saw inmates grouped in a circle around Chito, Death Row Joe, and Trenell. Chito was stabbed 14 times. 10 stab wounds were inflicted in the back, 2 in the hips, and 1 in the center of his neck. Chito was taken to Loma Linda Hospital in serious condition, but he survived. 2 sharpened table knives were found, one on the floor of the cell and another in a toilet bowl. On June 28, 1973, charges were dropped against Death Row Joe and Isaac Tranell for stabbing Chito in the holding cell due to lack of evidence. Keeping with the convict code, Chito refused to talk to law enforcement officials about the attack. Death Row Joe was convicted of possession of a knife, the original charge that brought him to the San Bernardino jail that allowed him to move on Chito. The first order of business under the new Constitution was to create a hit list. After the lopsided results of the 1972 war versus the Mexican Mafia, the new NF leadership planned on identifying the dead weight in the familia for execution, to put fear in the membership and strengthen the organization in the process. Babo and Death Row Joe issued hits on 3 familianos they considered to be traitors. They were Michael Fat Mike Rodriguez, Manuel Manito Garza, and Michael Pollo Cunha. Fat Mike Rodriguez was marked for execution for cowardice. According to Fig Avilo's autobiography, The Last General Standing, Fat Mike and 3 other familianos were housed in a dorm at Susanville. On October 4, 1972, Fat Mike was assigned to watch the door leading into the dorm for any approaching enemies or trouble. He observed 2 emeros approaching, and instead of warning the others, he ran away. Doroteo Sleepy Betancourt from Calexico and Eddie Pelon Moreno from Norwalk were both experienced killers and entered the dorm and killed NF members Frank Diamond Miranda from Fresno and Richard Bullwinkle Medina from Sacramento, Sacra as it was called. Fat Mike was later murdered by fellow familianos Fernando Sapo Yanez and Robert Pájaro Rocha on August 25, 1973 at DVI. The next member to be hit was Manuel Manito Garza. He was stabbed by Frank Chito Sanchez but survived. NF member Michael Pollo Cunha from Salinas was moved on next by Michael Peanuts Villasana and William Oso Romo. He too survived the attack, but minus 1 eye. All 3 hits took place on August 25, 1973 at DVI. La Nuestra Familia became a killing machine, both behind the walls and on the streets. This drew the attention of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, leading to defections and a series of prosecutions. In 1975, Death Row Joe wrote the street subdivision that governed NF members' code of conduct on the streets. The Nuestra Familia killing fields spread from behind the walls to free society. On December 22, 1976, Mexican Mafia associate Alejandro Knuckles Moreno was murdered in a Salinas area labor camp. Knuckles was placed on the Nuestra Familia's hit list because they believed he was a member of the Mexican Mafia. Back in those days, the NF's hit list contained names under 3 categories. Hamburgers was coded reference to Mexican Mafia members. UFOs was a coded reference to individuals suspected of being Mexican Mafia members or sympathizers. And hermits was a coded reference to Nuestra Familia dropouts. On November 6, 1976, Miguel Gabriel stabbed to death Roger Castillo because he mistook him for Knuckles. The bosses behind the walls were not amused. Later that month, Familia Lieutenant John Joseph Hernandez, also known as Mousy, paroled. He later testified that the same month he paroled, Clara Imperial provided him a matchbook with the names of 4 individuals in the Salinas area that Death Row Joe wanted murdered as soon as possible. Knuckles Moreno and Gloria Rice were 2 of the intended targets. We will discuss Gloria Rice's murder next, but let's continue with the murder of Knuckles. Art the Rock Beltran would later testify that in December 1976, Clara Imperial brought him an angry message from Death Row Joe in Soledad, wanting to know what was happening with the Rice and Moreno hits. Selected to carry out the Knuckles Moreno hit were Rafael Ernesto Gabriel, known as Little Ernie, or simply as Ernie, and Manuel Din Castro, known as Manny. He was the brother of NF Lieutenant Richard Din Castro, also known as Casper. Ernie and Manny came up with a plan to set up Knuckles by telling him that Ernie had some heroin, offered to get him high, and then administer a lethal overdose, aka a hotshot. Manny, Ernie, and Knuckles drove around Salinas in Knuckles' car, looking for a place to shoot up, and eventually stopped at the Joe Tocol labor camp, located on Fontes Lane. They entered the bathroom and 2 shots were prepared for Knuckles that would put down a horse, but he didn't go out. Ernie then began stabbing Knuckles, and Knuckles also pulled his knife and started fighting back. Manny jumped in and started stabbing indiscriminately and stabbed Ernie by accident. Knuckles was stabbed 38 times in the head, back, and chest. His lifeless body was discovered sitting, leaning up against the bathroom wall. Richard Din Castro, aka Casper, called Robert Pájaro Rocha and told him he needed assistance with a soldier that was wounded. Pájaro picked up Ernie at his home and drove to a restaurant outside of San Jose, where Ernie was picked up by Mousy Hernandez. Pájaro returned to Salinas and burned Knuckles' car to destroy evidence of the murder. Mousy contacted Familiano Joe Guerra from Sanjo and asked him to arrange for medical treatment for Ernie. Guerra picked up medical supplies and took Ernie to the home of a friend who was a nurse. The nurse removed the bandages covering the wound and blood began spurting out. The nurse told the men that the wound was too deep and she could not help him. The men then decided for Ernie to be treated at Alexian Brothers Hospital under an assumed name. On December 31st, 1976, Gloria Rice was murdered in a Salinas, California alleyway. As I mentioned earlier, Rice was one of the names on the matchbook Clara Imperial received from DR in Soledad and passed on to Mousy Hernandez in Salinas. We also learned that Death Row Joe was not happy with the Soldado's performance on the streets. Art the Rock Beltran testified that on New Year's Eve, 1976, he was at Clara Imperial's home and NF Lieutenant Richard Din Castro, that is Casper, came by and informed him and Clara that Rice would die that night. Rice was on the bad news list because she testified against Nuestra Familia soldier Raul Ralph Flores, who murdered her husband, NF Hermit Jack Rice, by shooting him in the head with a .38 caliber revolver on the midway of the Foley and Burke Carnival grounds in Salinas on July 18, 1976. NF Lieutenant Richard Din Castro, Casper, passed the assignment to NF squad leader Robert Pájaro Rocha and asked him to surveil Gloria Rice and learn her movements. Pájaro chose NF soldiers Rafael Ernesto Gabriel, also known as Ernie, and Jesse Black Jess Gomez. Ernie is the same soldier who participated in the Knuckles Moreno murder a few days earlier. He was recruited into the Nuestra Familia on the streets by Pájaro when Pájaro paroled from the CDC in August 1976. After studying her movements, the hit team became aware that Rice liked to score heroin at a specific dope spot located at 7.5 East Lake Street in an alley. On December 31st, 1976, Pájaro, Ernie, and Black Jess staked out the location and waited for Rice to come by for her daily fix. When she arrived, Ernie and Black Jess attacked her by stabbing her repeatedly as Pájaro supervised. Rice's lifeless body was found at 8:35 p.m., stabbed 94 times. She was pronounced dead on arrival at Natividad Medical Center. Pájaro reported the successful completion of the murder to Casper. On February 8, 1978, Death Row Joe and Babo Sosa were indicted in Salinas Municipal Court. On March 7, 1978, they were again indicted by the Monterey County Grand Jury on the same 8 counts filed in the Salinas Municipal Court. They were indicted for conspiracy to commit murder and murder for the executions of Gloria Rice, Alejandro Knuckles Moreno, Richard Cano Hernandez, and Edward Thomas Serna. Nuestra Familia runner messenger Clara Imperial was indicted on 1 count of conspiracy and murder for the December 31, 1976 murder of Gloria Rice. On February 27, 1979, Death Row Joe Gonzales was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of 7 to life for the murders of Gloria Rice, Alejandro Moreno, and Richard Cano Hernandez. The murder of Edward Thomas Serna was dropped due to lack of evidence. Babo Sosa was convicted on 1 count of murder and conspiracy for ordering the murder of Richard Cano Hernandez, but he was acquitted for the murders of Gloria Rice and Alejandro Moreno. Clara Imperial was convicted on 1 count of murder and conspiracy for the murder of Gloria Rice. On December 8, 1978, a second indictment in San Joaquin County named Death Row Joe, Babo Sosa, Felix Fig Avlios, and Lawrence Perico Saldivar in a 9-count indictment for conspiracy in the murders of Jerry Miranda Blanco, Rodney Hollinsworth, Morris Needham, Danilo Melendez, Robert Consol, Randy Allen Roth, Edward Gwynn, and Michael Rodriguez. All were killed in DVI except for Blanco. By this time, Babo Sosa had stripped Death Row Joe of his position and authority within the Nuestra Familia for misappropriation of funds and suspicion that he was working with law enforcement. Death Row Joe had indeed defected and ended up pleading to 3 counts of murder for the executions of Jerry Blanco, Daniel Melendez, and James Rodney Hollinsworth, and 1 count of conspiracy for the executions of Michael Rodriguez, Eddie Gwynn, Randy Roth, Robert Consol, and Morris Needham. But the hammer was about to fall, as this wasn't the end of the prosecutions. On January 19, 1992, Nuestra Familia became the first prison gang targeted using RICO, a racketeering law originally developed to target the Italian mob. It was also used unsuccessfully against the Hells Angels motorcycle gang and failed miserably. Using RICO against the NF was a perfect slam dunk case because the NF was known for committing their business to writing, something that brings grief to those involved in crime, especially behind bars. After a 5-year investigation by the FBI in Fresno and San Jose, working in conjunction with the ATF, a federal grand jury indicted 25 members of La Nuestra Familia. The indictment alleged the men engaged in murder, attempted murder, armed robbery, extortion, and trafficking in heroin. Death Row Joe Gonzales had already defected, had pled guilty, and was sentenced to 20 years to run concurrently with the 8 7-to-life terms he was currently serving in return for providing testimony for federal prosecutors. Death Row Joe disappeared into the federal WITSEC program and was housed in protective custody inside the Bureau of Prisons. I must admit, I never thought DR would ever again see the streets. That is, until I learned that in 2016 he was granted parole. Governor Brown reversed the parole board's decision on June 10, 2016. Brown stated in his reversal, and I quote, "I have considered the evidence in the record that is relevant to whether Mr. Gonzales is currently dangerous. When considered as a whole, I find the evidence shows that he currently poses an unreasonable danger to society if released from prison. Therefore, I reverse the decision to parole Mr. Gonzales." End of quote. At the age of 84, After 60 years behind bars, Death Row Joe remains incarcerated to this day. Are you prepared to surrender your life to the prison system? I can only imagine what message DR has for the youth of today. As I have said numerous times, there is no pot of gold at the end of the proverbial rainbow in that life. Short-lived glamour and temporary gang status are a horrible exchange for your loyalty to a gran mentira, a great lie. Calling out to you with open arms is a concrete box in some United States penal facility, or a box 6 feet under. When we look at life through the prism of evil, that is a way that seems right because you've drank the Kool-Aid. But the final outcome, as rightfully stated in Proverbs 14:12, are the ways of death. Please consider this before committing to la vida loca, the crazy life. Good night, and God bless you.